Welcome back to A Flourishing Start. Today's topic is a fun one, the power of play. We all know that young children love interacting with the world around them through play, but play also has a critical role in children's learning, development, and social emotional health during their early years. As we will learn, there is even a type of therapy based in play. To help us dive into this topic, we are excited to welcome two guests today, our first mother daughter pair on this podcast, Becky Wolozin and Dr. Danielle Murstein. Becky is a mom of two young children, ages 5 and 8. She is also one of my amazing coworkers at the National Center for Youth Law, where she is a senior attorney who uses litigation and policy to strengthen the rights of children and youth in immigration, education, and other areas. Welcome, Becky, to A Flourishing Start.
I'm so excited to be here.
Cute. And up next, of course, as mentioned previously, is Becky's mother, Dr. Danielle Murstein. Dr. Murstein is a child and adolescent psychiatrist who currently practices in Massachusetts. She has dedicated her career to helping individuals and families better understand themselves and their situations and make positive changes in their lives in schools, clinics, residential treatments, hospitals, and private practice. Her subspecialties include treatment of children on the autism spectrum, treatment of very young children, and play therapy. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you. I really enjoy this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics and favorite ways of doing therapy.
Ooh, I'm actually really excited about this one. So I'm so happy to have you both here talking with us today, both as mothers and as experts in your fields. And to kick off the excitement, Dr. Murstein, can you start by telling us a little bit about the importance of play to a young child's health and development?
Yes, basically, play in general helps a child to learn all the skills that they're going to need both in childhood and adulthood in terms of interacting with people socially, problem solving, being self-directed, creative, and so forth. And it
Yeah.
helps a child, children often don't have the words. It helps them to understand what is going on around them and master it if possible.
Interesting. We all know that playtime is like a big part of childhood, right? I mean, in general, you want to go outside, be with your friends, or even play with your mom and dad. But could you tell us a little bit about what exactly is happening in a young child's brain and body when they're engaged in play?
Wow, that's a big question. Um, Part of play, in terms of the physical part, is learning how to move about in space, integrate your body
Mm,
movements. There's a lot of connection between your brain learning about this and your body executing it. So, play teaches children physically a lot of things like agility, personal space bubbles, uh, those types of things. In the brain, you're actually forging connections and pruning connections at the same time. So you're reinforcing the connections that you need to grow up, and you're pruning some of the connections that end up being just kind of noise. We're all
mm,
born with many, many neurons, and part of the job from 0 to 2 or 3 is to prune off the things that are not helpful, but they're there as a possibility, depending on what our life experiences are.
oh. I actually didn't know that last part that like we're pruning what we should be keeping in our brains and then pruning off what doesn't make sense.
No,
Did I capture that?
we're reinforcing what should. We're making those paths stronger and we're pruning the ones that are not serving us.
Got it. And pruning means getting rid of. Right,
Yes.
Daniel?
And the
Got it.
reason that's very important, for instance, is that in very traumatized children, they will over prune to protect themselves emotionally from whatever trauma they're experiencing. And so part of working with traumatized children is to kind of open up pathways that have been closed down by fear or,
Mm.
you know, the other results of trauma. So that's part of the work when you're doing play therapy.
I'm just sitting with that just a little bit, Danielle, just because my brain is just learning alongside you right now. So I think my brain is trying to understand exactly what you just said. But it makes sense. I'm just allowing my brain to fully understand that concept. And thank you for sharing that, Doctor. Is it okay if we go to Becky and ask you a few questions just to see how it shows up in real life? But Becky, as a mother, what do you see your children learning through play?
Um, so I think that I grew up with the child psychiatrist mother and a neuroscientist father. So I'm thinking about the brain all the time.
Cool.
Um, and it's really fun for me to see my kids playing and to understand the work that that play is doing and to really enjoy the fruits of their labor, so to speak.
Mm.
So my kids play a lot. All kids play a lot. Kids need generally an enormous amount of time to play because everything is new to them, and that I really get to see that through my own kids. What they learn, everything around them, the way the world works that I know, they don't know. And so they see it, and then I see them using it in the way that they play with each other or even by themselves. Um, so, for example, my 5-year-old, he's extremely verbal. He wakes up talking, and he doesn't stop talking until he falls asleep at night. Um, and he doesn't always have somebody to talk to, so so he often has one or two toys of any kind, like cars or any object really, and he has them work things out. And so I can
Oh.
hear him making them have conversations about being angry at each other and how are they going to resolve that, or
Oh, wow.
um, exploring something and being brave even though they're scared. Or sometimes he's working out, like, what do you do if you just want to smash things all the time, right? But he's also
Mm.
working that out in play. So the cars are crashing and crashing and crashing and crashing, and then they figure out, like, let's do something else, and they divert their game to something else. And he is working out and practicing how, I can see that he's working out and practicing how to hold those feelings and thoughts and experiences and what to do with them.
Interesting.
Um, so I think, I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh yeah, I think that in a lot of ways, I'm also just I don't have children myself. I'm not a mother, but I do have two little kittens right now, and I see how much they play with each other and like how much trouble they get into. But in reality, I'm telling myself, I've had 27 years of understanding this world. These kittens have 12 months of knowing what life is. And so I kind of just have to try to relate to you in that sense, Becky, but at the same time, like, I've had other guests also bring up the fact that when children sometimes are in traumatizing environments or have been traumatized, they will also try to resolve or show that through play and try to figure it out on their own. And so, going back to this idea of therapy play, Dr. Murstein, could you give us a basic overview of what play therapy is?
Yes, of course. In play therapy, we use toys and other materials such as sand or other ways of playing to help a child to express all their mixed feelings, their conflicts, their questions in a way that's very supported and boundaried in the safety of the therapy office. So it's very different from parenting in the sense that we're not setting limits for the most part,
Mm.
only those limits for safety. You know, you don't get hurt, I don't get hurt, that kind of limit. Um,
Yeah.
And it helps children to express and learn how to name their big emotions, and especially those that are not socially so acceptable. So if a child gets
Mm.
very angry and has tantrums or says, I hate you, or says something not nice to somebody in the community, etc., in the play, they can express those things and learn how to express them in another way.
Mm.
Play therapy, very importantly, is child directed. So I'm not going to say, let's play with this, or I want you to do that. I'm going to see what the child chooses. And that's part of them learning to be more independent and to experiment, because they need to try different hats on and see, what suits them. Um, and the therapist, has had a lot of training and knows which ways to intervene to help bring out the child's uh, best person that they can be. It's different for every
Mm.
child. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just personally also very intrigued with this episode, like I mentioned, because when I had a traumatizing event happen in my life when I was around 10 years old, and I was introduced to a child psychiatrist for the first time. And I just clearly remember her allowing me to draw out a situation, a scenario where I was extremely angry and, let's just say, directed towards other people, and she allowed me to express those feelings through the way I was drawing out. And it was kind of the only place where I was allowed to have those big emotions, like you're saying, like that anger and frustration, in particular with adults at that time. And that's why I'm also just like hearing and trying to understand everything, because it's like really full circle. And I also really like this concept that you mentioned, Danielle, of like some big emotions are not really allowed to be expressed in a day-to-day life situation. Could you share a little bit of what kind of big emotions may not seem acceptable in a place other than this play safety play therapy?
Um, sure. Angry feelings are number one. Children cannot say to you in a calm voice, gee, I'm really angry that I didn't get to go to the playground today,
Hmm.
and instead they're going to act it out, which could be the source of a lot of problems, especially if they're hitting people or they're kicking sand in somebody's face or whatever they're doing
Hmm.
to express these big feelings. Also, confusion is a very big one. I think people think of play therapy as for kids who are having emotional difficulties, psychologically, and they think of ADHD or things like that, but also kids
Hmm.
whose parents have a chronic illness, kids who themselves have an illness, kids who had their tonsils out. There's all kinds of things that can be traumatic for kids that when people say trauma, they don't usually necessarily think of those kinds of things. Um, so kids have a lot of big feelings about those also, and sometimes when the adults around them are also distressed, like in a case of illness, it's very hard for the child to find someone they can really talk to about those things. I mean, I think this
Talk.
happened with COVID, actually.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
my mom's a early childhood educator for a TK class, and she just I remember when COVID was like in its we were still in like probably 2021. She just kept bringing up this idea of like the kids aren't playing outside, they're not getting this opportunity to play with each other, and that was just at the top of the mind for her as also like an educator. So it's just to me kind of comes to also show that it's really important and all around. But in particularly, COVID just made it really difficult to play in public spaces and even with their own families. And I kind of, not to jump back, but I kind of wanted to touch on this role again, Danielle. Um, what is the role of the parent or the caregiver in play therapy, if there is a role?
Oh, there's definitely a role. First of all,
But
there's no child who exists in isolation. The
yeah.
child is always part of a group, whether it's family or somebody else that's taking care of them. And I think the best things a parent can do are to be supportive of the therapy, which
Mm.
means coming to sessions, being on time, and accepting that their child may be expressing more big feelings that they might not be comfortable with. Whenever I'm working with a child, I always have parent sessions that are separate from the child, so that I can answer any questions the parents have. If, you know, a lot of people feel very self-conscious about playing with their child when they've always played fine with them, but now that they're going to child therapy, they wonder if they're doing the right thing. So, you know, sometimes I can just reassure parents that what they're doing is absolutely great, and maybe, you know, help to give a few tips if they ask for them, on what they could do. But most of the time, it's just really to be supportive of their child. That's the main thing.
That's beautiful. It's really sums it up to like, here's one thing you can do as a parent in this scenario. It's support the child in the therapy sessions. And so I think that really sums it up well of what the role of a parent slash caregiver has in play therapy. All right, Becky, in your professional work on behalf of kids, is play therapy something that you've seen being offered to children and families?
No. I will say that I think it would be hugely beneficial if it were offered much more broadly. But first of all, there's just not enough mental health services in general for young people and for kids in any of the spaces where I have worked as an attorney. And I think when there are mental health services, they often focus on, and I think my mom can probably comment on this too, a lot of medication, a lot of sort of quote unquote faster treatments that may be easier to do in a shorter amount of time, but often aren't necessarily what gets to the real root of what's going on and gives really space both to express and to practice, and then to be able to take that learning on into life. So I think that play therapy should, I mean, maybe I'm biased, but I think there should be a lot more play therapy. I think that every kid should have access to it because it's not just what we think of as typically traumatic situations where it can be hugely beneficial. It's a intervention and it's a service and a mental health necessity that can help young kids and especially very young kids learn the skills they need to be learning when they face any kind of difficulty. And often parents just never learned how to play in a therapeutic way with their kids, right? It's not really a part of how most people grow up. It's not a part of how most parents sort of view their role, I think. And so it makes sense that most kids wouldn't really get a play therapy experience. But I think there is room even to think about play therapy and, like my mom said, what skills parents can learn to play with their kids in a supportive, child-led way that gives kids autonomy and safety to explore their world.
If it's okay, I'd like to give a little example that Becky gave me permission to give about how children do their own therapy. In other words, you don't always need to take a child to a therapist, and sometimes, as my grandson does by talking to his cars and animals about his day and figuring things out, he's doing his own work. And when Becky was, I think, 2 years old, we were at a birthday party, and she was fooling around with a very old-fashioned piano that has one of those lids that slam down suddenly to cover the keys, and she slammed it down. Unfortunately, her other hand was right there, so she got a line of bruises right through the fingers there, and obviously it hurt a lot and there was a lot of crying. But what really interested me, and this was before I did my child specialty training, was that for the next couple of weeks, once it wasn't hurting as much, She would take a board book and close it on her hand and go, uh-oh, and look distressed. And then she would open the board book and go, all better now. And so
Hmm.
she was reliving and mastering this little trauma of hurting her hand in the piano by taking control of it with the board book. And I just thought that was such
Wow.
a wonderful example of how children learn to cope with something that happens to them. You know, even something that's not a huge trauma, but it's traumatic. It hurts. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think children do this all the time. If you watch them on the playground or, um, and I think there's so much determination to be on the developmental track. So like when you're watching a child, a baby learning to walk
Mhm.
and they fall down, they don't sit there and say, "Aw, poor me." They just get up and try again and again till they get it. And that's the wonderful thing about childhood is that children have this innate drive to grow and master their lives.
Wow. I just, I feel so, I'm like taken aback of in a few great ways. I'm like really proud when I see a child like play now. Like I feel like I have a whole different concept of what I'm looking at when I see a child play now. Like it's kind of like you can't unsee it once you've seen it and learned it. I think one term that stood out to me too is like what Becky you mentioned that like most parents like they can play with their child, but what does it mean to play in a therapeutic way? I think that's also like an interesting idea that I haven't heard of. So thank you for uplifting that. I am gonna go into another question for Dr. Murstein, if that's all right with you. I imagine that as a mother, grandmother, and child psychiatrist, you're pretty good at giving parenting advice. What's one important piece of advice that you've shared with Becky or that you want to share with our listeners that you can give to I kind of messed up the question there, but what's one piece of advice that you would give to our listeners or anyone else out there interested in therapeutic play?
Well, this is easier said than done, but I've done my best not to give Becky advice. And
Mm.
for the same reason that I tend not to give parents advice as much as to ask exploratory questions because people often know those answers, they just don't know how to get to them. But that being
Mm.
said, I can give some general kind of advice. Um, One is that transitions are very important. So be aware of all the transitions with children, like the separation to go to school, coming home after school, bedtime. These are all important transitions for parents to have a little bit of time without an agenda, like not on the cell
Mm.
phone, not worrying about dinner. Just take a few minutes to be there with your child during transitions. Another one is the concept of floor time, which is all over
Mhm.
the internet. It's kind of been lately focused on kids with autism, but it's good for any child. And that has to do with this idea of child-directed play. So it's called floor time because you get down on the floor with your child and you let them direct the play. They get to choose what to play with, they get to direct it, and the parent's job is to be interested and responsive but not take over the play. So,
Mm.
for instance, I was playing with a little boy at the hospital, and he had a building that was burning up. It was a fire, terrible, terrible. Everybody's trying to get away. And I said, "What would you like me to do?" So
Mm.
I'm inserting myself into the play, but he gets to decide. He could have said, "I don't want you." Well, what he told me was, "You're head of the firemen. You're going to come put out the fire." Now, as it turns out, this child was very angry, and that's
Mm.
part of why there was a huge fire happening, and he wanted me to help him with the fire. So the thing that's amazing about children is how much they can work with symbolism without even knowing they're doing it.
Wow, my mind was just blown. That's amazing. I everything you just mentioned, Danielle, I feel like I should have been writing it down on a notebook just so that I could have it for the rest of the year to like sit back on and like keep telling myself. Even though I'm not a parent, like I still think these are advice and things that any adult can really put into their own lives. Because we have children in terms of like nieces and nephews. We also have just friends who have children, and like I think what you just said applies to anyone listening right now. And I didn't hear this concept until right now when you said floor. What can you say one more time? Was it floor
As
play?
floor time.
Oh,
Yeah,
floor
Dr.
time.
Stanley Greenspan was the first one to label it that way and to bring it as a concept
Hmm.
that people can learn to do quite easily. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that fact there. I wanted to open up this point in the podcast to see if Becky, you want to ask your mom a question during this time, or if Danielle, you want to ask your daughter a question around this time, specifically to the topic that we're talking about. And feel free to take
Well,
a
I
second.
maybe while you think about it, Mom, I want to say something about advice to me, which is that you don't give it directly, and I really appreciate that. But what you have given me, well, sort of two things. One is you know that I'm a person who needs books. I when I don't know what to do, I turn to a book. And lucky me, my mom has an entire bookshelf full of books about child development and raising kids with who know what to do about their feelings and who can express and embrace their feelings. And so I will say that one of the books that you gave me at some point talked about um, talked about acting things out with your kids' toys as a way to give them information rather than telling them. Because if you say something directly, this was when Sammy, my oldest, was maybe 2. He was very little. Um, Rather than telling them to do something, playing it out and showing them what happens is often a more effective way. So this book was talking about that, and it turned into something my family did for many years, called DuckTales. We had bath time, and we had like a whole fleet of rubber ducks, and the rubber ducks would do things. We would play a game with rubber ducks, and sometimes Sammy would be the one who told the story, and sometimes I would be the one who told the story. And the ducks all took on different characters. There was Mommy Duck and Baby Duck, and then when my younger son was born, we had Big Brother Duck and Little Brother Duck, and we had a Nanny Duck, and we had all the different ducks. And when I knew something was coming up that was going to be difficult, or even just to prepare Sammy for what was going to happen, we're going to go see a show. What do you do at a show? You get to the theater. And then they went and they listened, and they were very quiet to hear what was happening. And then when it was over, they said, "Yay, we had such a good time." Right? And then he had the concept of what was going to happen. And I didn't have to get to the theater and say, be quiet, don't make any noise. Because he understood conceptually what we were planning to do. We also had times when he had, I was said, what happened to the ducks today? What did they do? And he said, "Oh, they made a big mess. They knocked everything over." And he would be able to work out like something that he was upset about, and I followed him as he resolved it with the ducks. So we had these DuckTales, and every bath he would say, "DuckTales, DuckTales." It didn't really work with my younger son as well, so that also shows like each kid is different, and you find what resonates with them. But that was something that came out of a book that my mom gave me, so she gave me that advice without even knowing that she was giving it to me. And so I'm always appreciative of that learning and of the learning I got just growing up with a mom who was serious about play.
That's a great line. I'm gonna borrow that, Becky. I think what Becky said really illustrates something that is sometimes hard for adults to understand, which is that when you're doing play therapy with a child, you never have to talk about the issue with real people. You don't have to talk about what's happening in your family or anything like that. It can be the mommy bear and the daddy bear or the ducks, and it's much easier for kids to express themselves when there's a little distance.
Mm.
So I know that sometimes people are upset because they say, but you didn't talk to them about, this and that. How are they going to learn? How are they going to handle it? But you don't have to with children. Amazingly, children's ability to work symbolically starts very young. Probably 14 months is enough. So it never has to be direct, and that's very protective for the child, because if they do feel too stressed out, it's not them, it's mommy bear and daddy bear.
Mm.
So that allows them to go at their own pace. Like what Becky was describing, I think, for going to the theater is perfect. It's just great.
I know this is gonna keep slipping my mind, but it's you keep saying like they're doing symbolic something. Can you tell me the phrase one more time?
They're working symbolically or using
Working
symbolism
symbolic.
to manage their feelings. Well, this is what Becky did with the board book that I mentioned earlier. So she didn't have a real piano. She's using the board book symbolically to hit the fingers and then to rescue the fingers herself. She's mastering it by saying, all better now. So she controls the book. She controls what happens to the fingers, and she decides that it's better now. So that's working in symbolism for her, since she didn't do it with a real piano.
I'm gonna let y'all see if there's a question you want to ask each other, or we can go on to the next one.
Yeah, I have a question. I would say to Becky, what is an example of something that happened as a child that you feel is now helpful to you as a mother? That's a tough question, I know. Or some experience that you had.
I think that what I have, I think that this is maybe one experience that I think that the way that I played with you and the way that I played with Dad was very different. And we had different ways of interacting with each other. And Dad was very physical and silly and outrageous. And I think you and I did more quiet activities together. We did a lot of reading and art and music, or just talking or snuggling. And I think that as a parent myself, I have seen how useful having different ways to play has been for my own kids, and it makes me appreciative that we had that and we sort of got to do all of that, and also gives me permission not to provide all those things myself, that like I can engage in the kind of play that I like to do that's fun for me, and my husband can engage in the kind of play that he likes to do that's fun for him, and what that looks like is very different, and they're both so important and valuable to my kids the way that they were both so important and valuable to me and my sister. So it's not one experience particularly, but I think if I'm honest, every day or every week or every month I do something and I surprise myself because it's something I didn't think about doing as a parent that I recognize came straight from you or Dad. So, but in a good way. Like I am lucky that I had such great parents. So when I'm turning into my parents, it's generally a positive thing. And I feel really, really grateful to have had that modeling, so that things that I know are really challenging for a lot of parents may become more easily to me, because that's how I learned to parent, by being parented that way. I think that is maybe my best answer.
That really, Actually, it was a point that I was thinking of making at some point, and you just expressed it, which is that if at all possible, do things that you love with your children because you'll convey your own enthusiasm and enjoyment of it.
Mm.
So, like Becky said, for me, it was probably more in the arts and reading and things like that because I really enjoy those things. Um, and I think that, the win-win is when everybody's enjoying it. So, and the whole family, it's bonding around fun, and something enjoyable.
I think I have a question actually, if we have time. Anyone?
Yes.
I'm curious if playing with your grandchildren, my kids, is different than it was to play with me and my sister.
Mm.
And how? Or if it's the same.
Yes, it's very different. I think in some ways it's training, but in other ways it's just having the distance, which I think is true for a lot of grandparents. When you're not the person who has to make sure your child is being socialized and, setting all those limits, it sort of frees you up as a grandparent to just be silly or just, to be with the child in a completely different way. That's why I think grandparents have the reputation for spoiling their grandchildren, right? It's just a different kind of a relationship. It's very freeing. And also, I think I was much more anxious as a parent than as a grandparent, Just want to make sure you're doing the right thing all the time. But by the time you're a grandparent, you're more comfortable in your skin. So.
Love that. Thank y'all for engaging with each other in that way. I enjoyed hearing y'all's questions for each other. So thank y'all for that. Before we wrap up, I have one question for both of you. If a parent or caregiver feels like they don't know where to start in terms of engaging in play with their young child, or maybe they feel a little awkward, or maybe they feel silly, what advice can you give them to help them just get started?
I can start while you think of an answer because you'll have a more professional answer and I'll have a more maybe life experience answer. And I'm going to do this based on my use of play during work. So I often don't know the kids that I'm working with as well as, I never know them as well as their parents, really. And so I'm coming in and I might not know exactly the best ways to play with them or what is most useful to them to play or what's going to help them express what I need to know as a lawyer. And so I think that my best advice is to just try something, and if it doesn't work, there's no downside. You just try another thing. It's sort of the lowest stakes experiment. If it doesn't work, then you just try something different. And the worst outcome is that you've spent some intentional, loving time with your child. So I can give one example. This was not a young child. I was doing an interview with a teenager. He was detained. He was an immigrant detained in immigration custody. And I was trying to help him express to me both what had happened in his past and what had happened to get him into this detention. And I came sort of armed with lots of ideas about different things that might be useful. So throughout the course of an hour with this young man, wasn't a man, this young teen, we used coloring, we acted things out using colored pencils as people to explain, how things had happened. And I will just never forget my epic fail in an attempt to use play with this kid who, because I didn't have teenagers at the time, so I was maybe bound to fail in this way. But I noticed that he was very, he needed to move around a lot. He had a hard time focusing. So I had this plan in my head that we're going to take a move break during this conversation. So I got up during this, 45 minutes into this conversation. I said, come on, we're going to do jumping jacks right now. And he looked at me like I was crazy. Because how embarrassing to get up and do jumping jacks in this we were in some kind of locked room, but there was a window and the guards could see him, and I got up and I started doing jumping jacks. I was like, come on, and he very reluctantly got up and did one jumping jack, and then he was like, all right, I did it, and then quickly sat back down. And he did not like that way of playing. But he did open up. He did smile. He laughed. And he understood that the intention of what I was doing was really for him. And that I was there for him. And I was willing to make a complete fool of myself to help him. And because I cared about him. And so even though the type of play was something that I have never, again, tried with teenagers that I'm working with, I think that commitment to doing it and to being in that space and that sort of in the silliness that play requires, being there with the child is also really, that's the gold. That's the specialness, that a kid will understand whether the actual form of play is, what they like or not. So that's my sort of professional example of being willing to experiment and try and fail, and kids have to learn how to fail also. So that's a really helpful model to show I had an idea, it didn't work out, how silly, we can laugh about it and move on, and it's fine.
And I totally second that. I also want to say that people have this within themselves already. They may not know it, but if you've ever seen people around a baby in public, people will make absolute total fools of themselves to interact with this baby and do peekaboo and do all kinds of things with the baby without even thinking about it or feeling self-conscious because it's a baby. And I think that's the same kind of thing. People need to clue into, what would they like to do? What would be fun? Follow the child's lead, but have a good time.
Have a good time. And I guess that's the perfect way to come to our closing on this episode of Play. It's just, we're here to have a good time. And also in the process, help a child express the big emotions that may not always be acceptable in a public setting. But we know that it's important for us to be able to express a wide range of emotions, including when we're a little child, 5 or younger. It's important for them, and I guess also for everyone at the end of the day, including those engaging in with them. So that wraps up our podcast episode. It got here a lot quicker than I imagined when we're talking about such a fun topic. But thank you so much, Dr. Murstein and Becky, for joining us, the first mother-daughter duo. It was really great to hear and learn from both y'all's professional and personal experiences. Thank you for joining us today on our podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the National Center for Youth Law. To suggest a podcast topic or to express interest in being a podcast guest, please email health@youthlaw.org.